Welcome to the Daily Report. It's Tuesday, April 5th here in Korea. The daily tally has rebounded amid the absence of the weekend factor, but it reportedly remains within expectations. We start now with the pandemic updates. I have Kwon-Soo standing by. So let's begin with the tallies for Korea.
Sure, Sunny. Infections did go up from the day before to 266,135 tallied as of 12 a.m. this Tuesday. And if we go over to our graph, we do see that is quite a jump from the day before, a little under 139,000 more cases from Monday. However, it also marks a drop by around 81,000 from last Tuesday. So we are still continuing this downward trend. And if we go over to our map, slightly more than 51% of cases have occurred in the metropolitan region. And due to the overall rise in cases from the day before, many places outside the capital region are back to 5-digit figures in daily cases from 4 digits from the day before. And now let's also take a look at the number of fatalities, standing now at 17,662 with 209 COVID-19 related deaths added in the past day. There has been a slight rise in the number of patients in severe or critical condition, as you can see, but not a big change, and also it marks a slight decline from what we had last week when we had over 1,300 patients in such a condition. Now, on the day before, we have a little over 2,800 and more than 2,600 people who have been vaccinated with their first or second dose or are now considered fully vaccinated. And we have more than 21,500 people who have received their booster shot on Monday. Now let's also take a quick look at the figures abroad. Over 1 million new infections have raised the total in the world to above 492.7 million. And then we've got around 6.17 million fatalities in total, with some 4,800 fatalities added. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for those tallies. Up next, we share with you more information about Korea's COVID-19 situation. And for that purpose, today I have Yoon in the studio. Yoon, welcome.
Glad to be here, Sunny.
Right, so despite the rebounding cases on this Tuesday, authorities assert Korea's COVID-19 situation is retreating. Right, Yoon?
That's right. That's right. As always, if we use the number of average daily cases, severely ill patients and deaths as an indicator of just how severe the COVID-19 situation is, well, all these barometers have come down compared to a few weeks ago. The country's 7-day average is hovering between 280 and 290,000 cases, which is a big drop from a month ago when the figure surpassed 400,000. We're also expecting to see a downward trend in the number of severely ill patients and deaths this week. After reaching a height of 1,315 critical cases last month, that figure has dropped to the 1,100 range. The daily death toll is also on the decline compared to last month, when we saw an average of roughly 360 weekly deaths. Authorities had once forecasted 800 weekly deaths in the worst case scenario, but now they believe this is unlikely to happen. The lower than expected numbers are being attributed to the Omicron variant's low fertility rate and the government's prioritization of treatment for high-risk patients, whether that would be distributing more COVID-19 pills or making wider treatment options available.
I see. Meanwhile, Yoon, what has been the public response to recent ease in social restrictions starting this past Monday?
Well, Sunny, yesterday I went to the streets of Gangnam to hear what people had to say about the latest rules. Honestly, I expected many to be excited given that they could meet more of their friends and stay out for longer. Now, while some did say that they were excited, others begged to differ. Now, here's a recap of the views and opinions that people shared with me yesterday. With South Korea ready to treat the pandemic like an endemic, authorities have again adjusted the social distancing measures. They took effect on Monday, but at a time when the country had already added over 202,000 new infections by 6 p.m., up by more than 90,000 from the same time a day ago. But Monday's easing of measures are hoped to be the final stage of social distancing before antivirus curbs are lifted altogether. With gatherings of 10 now allowed and business curfews pushed back to 12 midnight, how are people reacting to the latest modifications?
I didn't even know they eased measures again on Monday. I don't think it's that significant anymore either because antivirus measures have changed way too much.
I'm happy that I can meet my friends for an extra hour. Because back when restaurants and cafes could only open till 11 p.m., some of my friends who lived far away had to go home really early or couldn't even make it.
The nation's small business owners made it clear that only a partial easing isn't enough. They said they would have preferred it if all measures were lifted completely. More specifically, they hoped there wasn't any sort of curfew.
While restaurants and cafes may stay open for an extra hour, this doesn't mean they will be able to operate. Most employees who use public transportation have to leave before midnight anyways because there aren't any subways or buses that run late into the night.
I hope the authorities will soon ease all distancing measures because business owners like myself are way too exhausted. We can't endure this situation any longer.
The authorities are expected to reassess the measures in 2 weeks before making another announcement. Many are now hoping that this is the final modification to the distancing rules before all measures are lifted completely. Right, indeed, yeah, and there are high hopes that these latest measures will be the last set of such restrictions. And that being said, authorities are taking steps to transition into a new normal, right, Yoon?
That's right. With COVID-19 on its way to becoming an endemic disease, health authorities here are considering even shorter quarantine periods for those infected. As of now, people are required to self-isolate for 7 whole days after testing positive. And local hospitals and clinics are also being allowed to provide in-person treatment for COVID-19 patients, which used to be the exclusive domain of large medical centers in the past. Another change being considered is allowing COVID-19 patients to leave isolation for the purpose of picking up their medication from pharmacies. As of now, delivery services are being provided to people living alone without anyone to get their medication. Also from today, the price ceiling on self-test kits will be lifted. The Ministry of Food and Drug Safety had set a price cap of 6,000 won per kit, which is around $5 to stop price gouging and ensure stable supplies. Authorities had also limited the sale of test kits to take place strictly offline at pharmacies and convenience stores only. Now, this particular measure will last until the end of this month.
I see. All right, Ian, thank you for now. Do stay for more talks. Right, meanwhile, Soa, you are back at the desk with details from the latest COVID-19 briefing by authorities here.
Right, Sunny, and that briefing that is included a risk assessment of the pandemic situation in Korea, and that weekly assessment has usually been presented on Monday afternoon, but the government is going through some rescheduling of its government briefings and is gradually diminishing those briefings. So, according to Lee Sang-won, a health ministry official at Tuesday's briefing, South Korea's pandemic risk level remains unchanged at very high nationwide. Now, this as the country's current COVID-19 strategy is focused on treating the most severely ill, and that is still putting a burden on the medical front. While around 63% of ICU beds are occupied nationwide, in the non-capital regions, the rate stands at above 70%. However, Lee did refer to a number of positive developments. COVID-19 infections have dropped by close to 13% in the last week of March compared to the week before. Also, the reproduction rate of the virus in the same week fell to 0.91 from 1.01 on a week, dropping to below 1 for the first time in 11 weeks. And a reproduction rate below 1 represents a slowdown in the virus spread.
And so I understand the fall in infections was witnessed in all age groups.
Yes, that's correct, but in some age groups less than in others. In fact, recently most infections, or the age group that is representing the highest proportion of infections, is those aged 0 to 9 years old, and that because of lower vaccination rates as well as more frequent contact with other people. So per 100,000 people in that age group, the infection number stands at 1,015. Meanwhile, infections among people aged 60 and above is on the decline. It is lower than in other groups. And with that, the number of patients in serious or critical condition as well as COVID-19 related deaths have been recently falling as well. But officials do not rule out that the peak in these numbers is yet to come.
Until perhaps next week, our healthcare system may continue to feel a heavy burden of seriously ill patients who are still recovering after being hospitalized some time ago, more so than patients who have been newly admitted. After the following week, however, we believe there is room for those numbers to start declining.
Meanwhile, so how are authorities here assessing the threat posed by the Omicron subvariant BA2?
Well, first of all, currently 100% of cases are said to be either one of the two Omicron variants, or I should say the B1 or BA2. And BA2 now, 67.7% of domestic transmissions are said to be the stealth Omicron, and 76.7% of imported transmissions are the BA2. And it may account for almost all cases in the country in the near future. But because it has emerged in Korea before we reached the peak stemming from the original Omicron strain, an official downplayed risks of another surge.
After taking a broad look at the various indices, we believe it's more likely that the current downtrend will be maintained for the time being, rather than a fresh resurgence fueled by the BA2 variant. We also believe that the possibility of the country witnessing a double peak in its infection curve is currently low.
Now, we have also earlier this week spoken about the XE variant, which is a hybrid version of BA1 and BA2. Now, the government still says that in Korea, we have yet to detect one of those XE variants, and saying although XE has a chance to have a higher transmissibility, for now, we should not be too worried.
On the treatment front, so I understand we're looking ahead to more access to antiviral pills here in the country.
Right, Sunny, citing a smooth supply of anti-oral treatments, that is, the government laid out plans to make more citizens benefit from these oral pills. They will be made available at outpatient treatment centers for people who recover at home and wish to receive face-to-face treatment. Their plan will also include a preliminary provision of pills to medical centers for immediate distribution at nursing hospitals, nursing homes, and mental health centers. In a bid to lower the number of patients that develop serious or critical conditions and COVID-19 related deaths, starting Monday, oral pills are also being prescribed for at-home treatment patients whose earlier records of existing health conditions are difficult to trace, and those are being provided at general hospitals.
One last question, so did authorities address the possibility of shorter quarantine for COVID-19 patients that Yoon touched upon earlier?
Well, Sunny, nothing's decided yet, but an official Lee Sang-won at the earlier briefing did mention that in countries where this interval, this quarantine period that is, has been shortened to 5 days, just like in the US or UK, it's not based on how long the virus may be transmissible to others, but rather on whether the society can cope with people staying at home for 7 days. And he also mentioned that an assessment in Korea will follow in a post-pandemic response guideline later on.
Right, and we'll have access to that information later then. Let's include Yoon in our talk on the vaccination front. Yoon, I hear many vaccines are being discarded here in the country amid the slow that is uptake.
That's right. We do appear to have a huge surplus of COVID-19 vaccines, Sunny, because more than 640,000 doses have been thrown out in Korea so far this year. Even Novavax shots that started rolling out only some 2 months ago are being disposed of. And unlike what authorities had hoped for, of the 132 million vaccines secured by Korea, roughly 2% have been thrown out, and 7 out of 10 were Moderna shots. Now, this is mainly because Moderna shots haven't been approved to be used on younger age groups, unlike Pfizer vaccines. They're also very temperature sensitive and have a short expiration date as well. Moderna shots need to be stored in a refrigerator and can be used for only 30 days after the vial has been opened. And meanwhile, the country is expecting to receive an extra 145 million vaccine doses this year. But with vaccine passes no longer in use and many residents already double vaxxed, shots may continue going to waste, unfortunately. So we'll have to see, though, because fourth doses, or second boosters, if you'd like to call them, are being given out to those with weak immunity and people at high-risk venues like nursing homes. And authorities did explain that they're securing more vaccines ahead of the colder months in the fall and winter, where we could see another resurgence. And considering the limited shelf life half-life of these vaccines, authorities will need to get the timing right, especially when it comes to bringing new shipments in.
Right, and ever since the Omicron variant's emergence, there's also hesitancy towards using existing vaccines. But unless newly developed vaccines are out, officials continue to cite studies that do show that the benefits outweigh risks when it comes to existing vaccines. Yet, vaccine hesitancy in particular is felt among parents, as the inoculation process for children aged 5 to 11 is progressing much slower than it had been for their teenage or adult counterparts upon approval. Between March 31st, when the vaccination rollout for younger children started, and April 3rd, a little over 17,300 kids got their first shot. Almost 3.15 million are eligible. When including kids that have been vaccinated abroad, just 0.6% of the 5 to 11 age group have received at least one jab. The number is not expected to rise dramatically in the near future, as just 1.6% have made reservations so far. And that said, the vaccination expansion to children as young as 5 won't help much in using up the stockpile here in the country.
Right, and very briefly speaking, so I understand this unfortunate reality is not simply the case here in Korea.
Right, it is a global issue, and even developed countries like the U.S. are struggling with millions of stockpiles, and that's also why some of these developed countries are making donations to developing countries, but also in countries like Africa, there are discarding vaccines, as in many cases it's a lack of preparation for a vaccination program, including due to storage and expiration issues. And that's why experts say that improving the vaccination supply chain will be a task ahead in the post-pandemic era.
Well, it certainly looks like it. All right, so as always, thank you very much for the coverage. Yoon, thank you, and I'll see you on Wednesday.
Yes, will do. Thank you.
In our headlines at this hour, top nuclear delegates from South Korea and the US have met in Washington and addressed North Korea's latest displays of defiance, including its test launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile in late March. Our Yoon Jung-min reports.
The chief nuclear envoys of South Korea and the U.S. have reaffirmed that there needs to be a stern response against North Korea's continued weapons tests, including a push for a new UN Security Council resolution. They met in Washington on Monday to discuss regional security. Following a series of missile tests this year, North Korea launched an ICBM last month, a move considered to be a red line by the U.S., while reports suggest preparations for a possible nuclear test.
We agreed on the need for the UN Security Council to take strong measures, including pushing for new resolutions, given that this is a violation of multiple resolutions.
Those measures could include further tightening crude and refined oil supplies to North Korea, but it would require cooperation from other members of the Security Council. Currently, sanctions limit crude oil supply to North Korea by up to 4 million barrels a year and refined oil supply up to 500,000 barrels. Last month, the Security Council convened a meeting after the regime's ICBM test, but did not issue a statement condemning North Korea due to objections from China and Russia. At the same time, the two officials reiterated that Seoul and Washington remain open to diplomacy, saying it's up to Pyongyang to choose talks.
We remain open to diplomacy, but it really is up to Pyongyang to decide the path forward. They can choose to talk to us, to negotiate with us towards our shared goal of denuclearization.
The U.S. envoy said he will soon visit South Korea after he was invited by No. He added that he hopes to hold talks with South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol and his team as well. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
In other news, Russia is reportedly realigning its forces and focusing its fight in eastern Ukraine. This shift in strategy comes amid raging global anger over allegations of atrocities against civilians in Ukrainian regions that had temporarily been under Kremlin's control. Our Kim Yo-sun has more.
Russian forces have reportedly fully withdrawn or at least significantly reduced their presence in a number of Ukraine's northern regions. Citing sources, Reuters said Monday that Russian troops have been scaling down operations in the region to focus on the eastern part of the country. Reuters added the Russian troops have abandoned their vehicles and munitions while leaving landmines around private homes and in forests. A senior U.S. defense official also confirmed Russia has repositioned about two-thirds of its forces from Ukraine's capital area. Speaking on the condition of anonymity, the official said Washington estimates the Russian forces will likely be redirected to Ukraine's east. Against such a backdrop, Lithuania has expelled the Russian ambassador to the country. The move comes as global outrage rises over civilian killings in northern Ukraine, where a mass grave and tied bodies shot at close range were found in Bucha, a town wrestled back from Russian troops. Germany is also expelling around 40 staff members at the Russian embassy in Berlin. France is kicking out 35 Russian diplomats. U.S. President Joe Biden described the atrocities allegedly committed by Russian forces as, quote, a war crime, calling for Russian President Vladimir Putin to be put on trial. While he did not label the killings a genocide, he said the U.S. is looking at imposing even more sanctions on Moscow. The EU is also seeking to impose additional sanctions against Russia, with Brussels condemning Moscow in the strongest possible terms for the reported atrocities. The UN's human rights chief also said the images from the Bucha region point to possible war crimes. The Kremlin denies Russian forces have killed civilians, calling the images fake. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Korea's inflation has hit a decade high, driven by escalating energy expenses and commodity costs amid the conflict in Eastern Europe. Our Min Soo-kyun has more on the consumer price acceleration in the month of March.
South Korea's consumer prices are unbelievably high. The consumer price index in March stood at 106, up 4.1% from a year ago. Consumer prices saw on-year rises of more than 3% for 5 straight months from October last year, but the figure in March is the largest jump in over a decade. The last time inflation topped the 4% mark was in December 2011, when it hit 4.2%. The country's skyrocketing inflation is mostly due to soaring energy prices.
Consumer prices rose 4.1% as prices of industrial goods, such as petroleum products and processed foods, as well as costs of personal service like dining out, continue to rise.
Prices of petroleum products were up more than 31% on year, accelerating from a 19% rise in February. The price of gasoline rose about 27%, while diesel and LPG jumped by about 38% and 20% respectively. The cost of personal services also edged up 4.4% from a year earlier, with the price of dining out rising 6.6%, the biggest increase in more than 20 years. Seeking to curb inflation, the government has decided to expand tax cuts on fuel consumption. Starting May, it will temporarily increase fuel tax cuts to 30% from the current 20% for 3 full months. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. A recent filing shows Tesla boss Elon Musk owns 73.5 million shares in Twitter, making him the microblogging site's top shareholder with a 9.2% stake. Based on stock price as of Friday's close, his share of Twitter is valued at roughly $2.9 billion. While Musk is a prolific Twitter user with over 80 million followers since joining the site in 2009, the move comes on the heels of a tweet in which he said he was giving serious thought to building a new social media platform while questioning Twitter's commitment to free speech. Musk has also been selling off some of his Tesla holdings since November, when he said he would offload 10% of his shares. He has since sold $16.4 billion worth of stock. Costa Rica and Serbia held their presidential elections in the past few days, which resulted in not-so-surprising results. Over in the Central American country, anti-establishment economist Rodrigo Chavez clinched the election, upending decades of political consensus in a country that's grappling with growing social discontent and mounting national debt. The former World Bank official garnered more than 52% of the vote, beating Jose Maria Figueres. Meanwhile, over in Serbia, the incumbent Alexander Vučić secured an easy win in the country's presidential election as he ran for a second 5-year term on a promise of peace and stability amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Vučić's ruling Serbian Progressive Party also won the vast majority of the votes in parliamentary election. Zimbabwe's central bank raised its key interest rate to a record 80% from 60% in order to halt a decline in the value of its currency. The latest rate hike also comes as the country has been facing surging inflation amid food and fuel price pressures due to the war in Ukraine. The current rate is at the highest level since the country's central bank set the rate at 70% in September 2019. Since the previous hike, the Zimbabwean dollar has lost nearly 2/3 of its value against the greenback, with annual inflation reaching over 72%. The International Space Station is set to welcome its first all-private astronaut team later this week. The crew are from Houston-based startup Axiom Space, and the mission is being hailed by NASA and other industry players as a turning point in the latest expansion of commercial space ventures. Weather permitting, the 4-man crew will lift off on Friday from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, riding atop a Falcon 9 rocket. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Up next, we bring you a weekly focus on events beyond Korea, and today we turn to neighboring Japan. For more, I have Hiroaki Wada live on the line. Hiroaki, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Same here. Thank you for having me.
Right, Hiroaki, I hear signs of a rebound in COVID-19 infections are putting a slight damper on the cherry blossom season there in Japan. Let's start with the COVID-19 situation there.
Yeah, a little bit of worries, as you mentioned. The number of new cases was going down since early February. But the trend kind of changed in late March, and it's creeping up since then. And as you mentioned, Japan was going through a cherry blossom season. The flowers are very popular here, and people are fed up with the restrictions, so a large number of people went out to see the blossoms. So I am afraid that we're going to see more infections later this month. The number of deaths, hospitalization, the number of deaths, serious cases are still going down, which is a good sign, but still worrisome. And Prime Minister Kishida wants to curb a 7th wave in Japan because we're having a upper house parliamentary elections in July. Getting rules on the COVID-19 is not a good sign for voters, so he wants to control it and trying to accelerate second booster shots to show the voters that he's doing his job properly.
Right. Hiroaki, meanwhile, Tokyo is hosting an art exhibition that is causing quite a bit of controversy for featuring works, including the Comfort Women statue. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular event? Right.
This one has attracted a lot of criticisms from nationalists. In the past 2 to 3 years ago, there was an exhibition featuring the Comfort Woman statue, and the event had to be cancelled because of a strong opposition. And this time around, a similar situation happened. There are supporters too, and the event is pretty popular. All the reservations have been filled up until today, which is the last day of the exhibition. But at the same time, nationalists came to near the venue and used soundtracks to blare out slogans against the exhibition. So police have to stay on guard to protect the exhibition and visitors. But there are also people who are supportive of the show, and they stood near the entrance to the venue and held up some signs showing the support for it.
Right, I see.
And yeah, this show is going to be to go around the nation, and I expect similar reactions in the future.
Right. Also on the subject of controversy, Hiraki, the contents of history textbooks to be adopted by Japanese high schools starting next year are causing a bit of contention between Seoul and Tokyo, as authorities here in the country believe efforts have been made to perhaps whitewash wartime atrocities. What has been the response over there in Japan?
Well, the government, as you pointed out, the government checks the contents of textbooks used at schools. And this time, government checkers complained to some of the expressions in those textbooks, saying that they are not in line with government positions on those issues. And one of them was the island between Japan and South Korea, the one we call Takeshima, and the one you call Dokdo. And one of the textbooks said that it is Japan's own territory, and the checkers didn't like the expression and said that they should use stronger expression, something like the island is Japan's integral and inherent territory, meaning that the island never belonged to other countries. And we also had some cases of government checkers recommending more neutral expressions about South Korean rebels in Japanese factories during World War II. And some of the publishers try to avoid the change of expression in accordance with the government's recommendation, and changed expression like forced labor to, mobilization or recruitment.
I see. Hiraki, because we have a lack of time, I'm going to go on the diplomatic front then. Okay. Against that backdrop of the historical disputes between Seoul and Tokyo, what are prospects there in Japan about the future ties of Seoul and Tokyo as the incoming Yoon administration seeks to take office in May?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't really see a lot of enthusiasm, at least among the Japanese public, about seeing a better relation with South Korea. I mean, of course, we want better relations, but expectation levels are pretty low, I would say. And right now, I think we are waiting for the new South Korean leader and his government to make clear stance on how they are going to deal with Japan. So it's kind of wait and see attitude. And last year, the government did opinion survey, and the percentage of people who feel close to South Korea was just 1/3 of the total. So that kind of emotion may linger for the foreseeable future, unless there's major change in both sides policy. But South Korean culture is pretty popular in Japan. That's a surprising thing. So, people in their late teens and 20s, or women, feel very close to South Korea. And that is a very, among young people, the popularity is like 60%. 60% people feel close to South Korea.
Right.
But, South Korea is not really popular among men and those in their 60s and 70s, unfortunately.
But hopefully we can make most of the favorable opinion, perhaps, to improve bilateral ties in the near future. All right, Hiraki, as always, thank you very much for the latest with regard to issues in Japan.
Thank you.
April 5th, that is today, Korea celebrates Arbor Day. And in light of this occasion, we revisit issues related to the environment in this edition of our panel discussion. For more, I have Professor Chung So-young from Korea University. Professor Chung, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
I also have Professor Christian Franz K. at the Busan National University. Professor, it's good to have you on as well.
My pleasure.
Right, Professor Chung, we'll start here in the studio. April 5th, like I mentioned earlier, marks Arbor Day here in the country, but there are growing calls for this particular day to be reset or commemorated, that is, in March. Could you start with an explanation behind these calls?
That's one of the very good examples why we need to take care of the climate change issues seriously. Because when this day was first introduced in 1946, actually compared the average temperature at the time and then the average temperature this year, there is about 3 degrees actually increased. So which means that there might be a different timing in terms of planting trees. So that's based on this scientific understanding that there has been some of the strong opinions coming out in terms of the moving that important day to March. And so finally decision will be up to the government. But this might be one of the important factors that the government needs to consider.
Right, I see. And Professor Franske, simply speaking, the universal goal with regard to climate change is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, I understand. Now, what is the significance of this particular goal?
This goal was set during the Paris climate negotiations in 2015, and they basically said we have to limit global warming below 2 degrees and if possible even to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to accomplish this, countries have submitted nationally determined contribution outlining their climate action plans towards this aim, towards carbon neutrality. And those national contributions would then collectively lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to where current policies stand. But unfortunately, even if we just look what countries promised, we would still go to a warming of somewhere between 2.6 and 3.1 degrees warming by 2100. So this means we have to really improve our plans to limit warming to 1.5 or 2.0 degrees. And why is 1.5 degrees very important? So if we just compare this, what would happen if we would actually, instead of limit it to only 2 degrees instead of 1.5 degrees, that would mean about 10 million more people would lose their homes due to sea level rise. That's also something we here in Korea face. Twice as many people would face water scarcity, especially say in Africa and such countries. And more than 1 billion people will face extreme heat waves every year. So this means in order to really achieve, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and also to avoid all those damages. They also would damage our economies, so we really have to speed up our efforts.
Right, and against the dire portrait painted right now by Professor Franske, Professor Chung, I understand pundits believe that current geopolitical matters, including the crisis over in Ukraine, look to push concerns over climate change to the back seat. What are your thoughts?
Well, that is true because one of the heart of all these issues related to Ukraine situation is about how to deal with the energy supply and the demand, especially in Europe. And as we know that Russia has provided a lot of natural gases through the 2 pipelines to Germany and other European countries because of the disruption of this pipeline supply, which means that then countries in Western Europe may need to find other immediately available sources of energy, which might include controversial coal and other fossil fuels. So this might disrupt all these efforts based on the concerted efforts made by the UNFCCC process among the countries to some degree. But I think that we never think that this will be a permanent setback, maybe a temporary setback in aligning our efforts with another new strategies based on the geopolitical situation. So in the sense that there should be no stop in making the further efforts to address climate change by the countries.
Right. And meanwhile, Professor Franske, I understand you're engaged in an extensive research project on climate change. Could you tell us a bit that is, about your undertaking?
Yes. I'm working here at Busan National University. We have an Institute for Basic Science Center for climate physics, and we also have a supercomputer, which we call Aleph, which is, of course, a very powerful tool for our climate research projects. And just to give you an impression how powerful this computer is, it would take me or you about 45 million years to complete the calculations that our supercomputer can perform in 1 second. And we actually need this computing power because we run very complex Earth system models, which encode our understanding of the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, so that we can include what happens in the atmosphere, the oceans, and ecosystems. And with this, we can run future climate simulations so that we can understand or get an impression what will happen if we don't stop emitting CO2 emissions. And from those simulations, we learned that, for example, that in the future, we will have less typhoons, but the typhoons which still form, they will become more intense and also can then cause more damage.
Professor Franz K., based on your findings then, what look to be the repercussions of relentless rises perhaps in greenhouse gas emissions?
So, of course, I mean, we have to limit basically our emissions, that the greenhouse gas concentrations stay below a certain limit in order to limit the changes to the climate system and also ecosystems, which would also affect us all. For example, every additional 1.5 degree of warming would further rise or lead to rises in sea level, increases intensity and frequency of hot extremes like heat waves or heavy precipitation, which then consequent flooding, which can cause lots of damages, and also we might have to face more drought conditions, which would then affect food supply.
Right, indeed. And Professor Chung, Korea itself has signed into stone, if I may say so, its intentions to ensure carbon neutrality by 2050. What are the implications of this latest initiative here in the country?
Right. Last month, we introduced a new basic law in order to realize the carbon neutral policy in Korea. I think it is in line with Korea's concerted efforts for many years, actually starting from the low carbon green growth policy, and then now we have carbon neutral policy. So in general, generally speaking, I think we are making a good stride actually to make ourselves in line with what we are supposed to do in the global context to address climate change. And then this act, laid out the basic framework of what we are supposed to do, including the setting up the new commission and also focusing on different sectors that we need to work on. And it also includes one very significant provision about promoting international cooperation to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions that can be used by the Republic of Korea for achieving its national target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So overall, it's a very good achievement. However, there are certain things that incoming administration needs to deal with, because there is some this bill was made in a very short period of time. So there are several issues that needs to be further addressed by the incoming government, including how we can make the energy mix more realistic in the Korean context. We know that there are some controversies going on between nuclear and then renewables and then actual science-based research, and also a policy decision-making needs to be made under this framework by the incoming government. And there are also some other issues that I'm sure that this incoming government will address.
Right. And Professor Chung, speaking about the incoming government, there are pundits who claim that the new administration is taking the reins of the office at a very crucial time, that its 5-year term in office will prove to be very, very important in tackling climate change. Do you care to elaborate on this view?
Yeah, sure. Every country's climate change policy needs to be understood and developed in the context of global framework under the Paris Agreement. So if we take a look at the Paris Agreement, many people don't know this important fact that last year was the first year of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So we just started to implement the Paris Agreement, and in accordance with the UN calendar in addressing climate change, there are many important deadlines that the countries need to comply with. For instance, next year, which will be the first so-called global stock taking, that's where head of the states may come together in the UN meeting and review their national implementation of the climate change policy all together. So that's very important. Year after, in 2024, this is the first year that every country under the Paris Agreement needs to submit their national report to the UNFCCC, and it will happen either in every 2 years, every 5 years. So first, events that we need to take care of by this new administration will be extremely important.
Right. And Professor Franske, Korea plans to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 2018 levels by the year 2030. What do you propose to ensure this reality?
I mean, we of course have to stop using fossil fuels. So that means, one measure would be that maybe the government also mandates that only electric cars are allowed to be sold after a certain date. I don't know, maybe at the end of this decade, so towards 2030. But I would also say that also provides some opportunities for the Korean industry so that it could become a market leader in electric cars or hydrogen cars, battery technology and such things. And of course, we have to transition to renewable energies, and also we all in our personal lives have to reduce our energy usage. So I think we all can contribute a little bit towards this goal.
Right. And staying with that goal, Professor Jang, what can you share with us about President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's environmental policies, perhaps, especially those related to climate change?
Well, I think, as I just indicated, that there will be certainly a continuation of, Korea's efforts to address climate change based on the carbon neutral policy. I think this will be continued. However, there are certain important changes to be made. First of all, as I indicated already, that there is important steps that incoming administration needs to make. That's considering how we mix the different energy sources, including nuclear and renewables. Considering that Korea has very few natural resources available. It's a small country having a lot of population, and we have many mountains. And then our answers to deal with renewables might be different from other countries. For instance, also I think that the Yoon Suk-yeol administration will be more pro-market and technology. So in other words, that from my point of view, Moon Jae-in administration put its emphasis on introducing a lot of regulations, which was also important in terms of giving signals to the market. But I think that Yoon Suk-yeol's administration will promote more market. Also, lastly, I think Yoon Suk-yeol's administration will be more international, in a sense of promoting the international markets and technologies at various international meetings and other organizations.
Right, hopefully that will be the case.
Yeah.
And Professor Franske, could you remind us perhaps about the importance of forecasting climate patterns perhaps to better tackle climate change in itself, especially based on the research that you're currently involved in?
Yes, we don't really forecast the climate. What we call this climate projections, because in order to learn something about how the future climate might evolve, we have to make certain assumptions about the greenhouse gas emissions we as a society will emit in the future. So we have the different scenarios which are based on how fast we might transition to renewable energies, and also other societal changes, the technological progress and such things, and how well different countries collaborate internationally. So we make those future climate projections, and then we can basically say if we transition very quickly to renewable energies, then we can limit global warming to a certain degree, and that also means we might only face a certain amount of sea level rise, and so that then also say the city of Busan, where I live, can actually adapt to this in time, so that no houses will be flooded and so on. Then we can also see how many typhoons might hit Korea in the future, so that also we as a society can adapt. And also we can see how many extreme events we might have to expect, because they would also create damages. So we can basically balance the expected damages if you don't limit greenhouse gas emissions sufficiently with what we actually would need to pay for the energy transition. So that's also something we have to understand, that even if we don't do anything, this also would involve a certain amount of costs.
Right, of course. I suppose we need to have a better understanding of the challenges we actually face then. Professor Chung, what can Korea strive to do to play a greater role, perhaps, in addressing global climate change?
Well, you are talking about the global climate change. And then, as I always say, that the starting point for Korea should be how to best work together with the major global international organizations to address climate change in Republic of Korea. We have two major global organizations, including Global Green Growth Institute and Green Climate Fund. And these two organizations are very important in terms of the providing assistance to developing countries, in terms of the making plans to grow their economy in a low carbon way. And then for that, you need to have a financing. And we have a financing organization, that's the GCF. So if Korea can make its great efforts at working closely together with these two major organizations, we also have other organizations in Korea. I think we can be a center of the global climate politics and economy. So in the sense that that should be the starting point, and every global climate policy in Republic of Korea needs to be further developed based on this basic important factor.
Right, so we have the infrastructure ready. And having said that then, Professor Franske, do you suppose that the public here in Korea has a strong perception of the importance of addressing perhaps climate change? As a foreign scholar looking at the situation in the country, Professor Franske.
Yes, I think Korea understands the challenges we are facing, and it's also my impression talking to my colleagues and people here in Korea that they are also willing to kind of address the problems.
Right. What more perhaps could the government do to encourage its members of the public to take greater action perhaps?
One thing is, of course, introducing some kind of a CO2 tax, so that maybe everybody sees also in their daily lives, if they buy certain things or services, how much this actually would contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So that would be a price signal, which I think is also very easily to understand. And I think probably also to tell industry or customers to say, if we don't have to switch to electric cars, that at a certain date only electric cars are allowed to be sold. I think such signals would be very good.
Right, tangible. Right, they're quite tangible, and they're also quite valid proposals there. All right, Professor Franske, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. Professor Chung here in the studio, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have today. Do join us again tomorrow. That would be Wednesday, same time. In the meantime, thank you for watching.